I didn't move to Mexico because I was reckless or chasing something young and shiny, even though that's the easy version people tell themselves. I moved because I was tired of waking up every morning feeling like life had already finished without asking me. My name is Daniel, I'm 59 years old, and when I crossed the border with 2 suitcases and a quiet kind of hope, I believed love would be the thing that finally made everything feel right again. I had been divorced for 7 years by then, not a dramatic ending, just the slow kind where you stop fighting because there's nothing left to argue about. The house was sold, the routines dissolved, and suddenly the days stretched longer than I knew what to do with. Friends still worked, my daughter had her own life, and I was left with this strange freedom that didn't feel like freedom at all. It felt like standing in a wide open room with no furniture and no idea where to sit. Mexico wasn't an impulse decision, at least not entirely. I'd visited a few times over the years, enough to know the mornings were warmer, the people spoke slower, and the air felt less sharp than back home. Retirement forums talked about affordability, sunshine, healthcare, and community, but none of that is what pushed me. What pushed me was the quiet. The kind that presses on your chest at night and makes you wonder if this is what the rest of your life is supposed to sound like. I rented a small apartment at first, nothing fancy, just clean white walls, a balcony that caught the late afternoon light, and a view of a street where life seemed to move without urgency. The first weeks felt like relief. I walked more, I slept better, I smiled at strangers and they smiled back. For the first time in years, I felt seen in small ways that mattered more than I expected. That's where I met her. Not in some dramatic way, not at a bar or a resort, just in the rhythm of daily life. She worked near the place I had breakfast most mornings, and we started with simple conversations, polite at first, then warmer. Her name was Sophia. She was younger than me, yes, but what struck me wasn't her age, it was the way she listened. When I talked, she didn't rush to fill the silence or glance at her phone. She looked at me like the words mattered. That feeling is dangerous when you haven't felt it in a long time. You don't question it, you accept it as proof that something good is finally happening. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was old enough to know the difference between affection and illusion. But there's a part of a man that doesn't age the way the rest of him does, the part that still wants to be chosen, still wants to feel useful, still wants to believe he's not finished yet. We spent weeks just talking. About her family, about my past, about the small disappointments that pile up quietly when you're not paying attention. I liked that she had responsibilities, that she spoke openly about helping her mother, about looking after her younger cousin. It made her feel grounded, not carefree in the way I was used to seeing younger people portrayed. It felt real, and real felt safe. When the relationship shifted from casual to something more defined, it didn't feel like a leap. It felt like a gentle step forward. I paid for dinners more often than not, but that seemed normal. I helped with small things, groceries here, a utility bill there, always framed as temporary, always accompanied by gratitude. I didn't feel used. I felt needed, and that distinction matters more than most people admit. The first time one of her family members stayed over, it didn't raise alarms. A few nights turned into a week into a month. It was always explained, always reasonable. Someone was between jobs, someone needed help, someone would be moving on soon. I nodded along because saying no felt cruel, and cruelty felt like the opposite of who I wanted to be at this stage of my life. I told myself this was what relationships looked like here. Different, yes, but not wrong. I reminded myself I was the outsider, the guest in another culture, and that understanding meant flexibility. I didn't want to be the older foreign man who complained about customs he didn't understand. I wanted to be respectful, adaptable, generous. Those words became shields I used to protect myself from questions I didn't want to ask. What I didn't realize then was how easily generosity turns into a role you can't step out of once people start relying on it. Every time I covered something, it became easier the next time, not just for them but for me. It was simpler to pay than to explain, simpler to agree than to risk tension, simpler to stay quiet than to admit I was uncomfortable. I had spent most of my life avoiding conflict, and retirement hadn't cured me of that habit. There were moments, early ones, where I felt a small tightening in my chest, a sense that I was drifting from the life I thought I was building. I ignored them. I told myself love requires compromise, that relationships aren't clean lines and clear contracts. I had waited a long time to feel connected again, and I wasn't eager to interrogate the thing that finally made the days feel full. At night, lying in bed, I sometimes thought about how easily I had slipped into this version of myself, the one who adjusted without asking what he was adjusting away. I thought about the man I used to be, cautious, deliberate, proud of his independence. I told myself that version of me was too rigid, that this new softness was growth. It's easy to reframe fear as maturity when you want to believe you're doing the right thing. I didn't think about cost then, not real cost. I thought in terms of money spent, favors given, time shared. I didn't consider the deeper price, the slow reshaping of my boundaries, the quiet erosion of my sense of choice. I believed love would save me from loneliness, from regret, from the feeling that I had missed my chance at something meaningful. What I didn't yet understand was that love doesn't save you if you hand it the keys to your life without asking where it's taking you. Looking back now, the signs weren't dramatic. There was no single moment I can point to and say that's where everything changed. It was a series of small decisions, each one reasonable on its own, each one slightly heavier than the last. And that's the part I want you to hear, especially if you're watching this thinking you'd never let something like this happen to you. It doesn't begin with loss, it begins with relief. It begins with feeling wanted again. And that makes everything that follows harder to see clearly until you're already standing somewhere you never meant to be, wondering how you convinced yourself this was what starting over was supposed to feel like. By the time I realized how full the apartment had become, it no longer felt like my place to question it. Shoes by the door that weren't mine, voices in the kitchen early in the morning, conversations I couldn't follow but could still feel the weight of. I told myself this was temporary, that families everywhere have moments where they lean on each other, and that I was lucky enough to be in a position to help. That word help became my favorite explanation because it sounded generous instead of afraid. Sophia never asked directly, not in a way that felt like a demand. She didn't need to, the needs were always there, already waiting in the room. A refrigerator that needed filling, a cousin who needed school supplies, a mother whose rent was late. Each situation was framed as an emergency but spoken with calm, as if it was understood that of course I would step in. And I did, because stepping back would have required a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I remember one afternoon in particular, sitting on the balcony while the city hummed below, realizing I hadn't been alone in weeks. Not truly alone. Even when the apartment was quiet, there was the sense that someone might arrive at any moment. That space was no longer something I could count on. That should have unsettled me more than it did, but by then I had adjusted. You can get used to almost anything if it happens slowly enough. Friends back home would call and ask how retirement was treating me. I told them it was good. I talked about the food, the weather, the warmth of the people. I didn't mention the crowded rooms or the way my bank balance seemed to dip a little faster each month. I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I didn't want to admit that I wasn't sure where my life was headed. There's a particular kind of embarrassment that comes with realizing you might be losing control later in life, when you're supposed to have things figured out. Sophia noticed my hesitation sometimes. She would reassure me without being asked, reminding me that family was everything here, that taking care of one another was a shared responsibility. I nodded because arguing against that made me feel selfish, even though part of me wondered where my own needs fit into that picture. I had come to Mexico to simplify my life, not to rebuild the same patterns of obligation I thought I'd left behind. The age difference started to feel more pronounced as time went on, not in how we spoke to each other, but in how we saw the future. She talked about plans, about possibilities that stretched decades ahead. I listened and smiled, aware that my timeline felt shorter, more fragile. That awareness made me more accommodating than I should have been. When you're conscious of time passing, you're less willing to risk the present by challenging it. There were days when I tried to reclaim small pieces of independence. I'd suggest going for a walk alone or spending an afternoon reading somewhere quiet. Even then the guilt followed me. If I was enjoying myself, who was I letting down? That's how twisted my thinking had become. Leisure felt like abandonment, solitude felt like betrayal, money stopped feeling like a tool and started feeling like a language. It was how problems were solved, how appreciation was expressed, how tension was avoided. The more I used it that way, the harder it became to imagine a conversation that didn't end with me reaching for my wallet. I wasn't being pressured in the way people imagine pressure. There were no threats, no raised voices, just expectations that had settled in comfortably, like furniture no one remembered moving in. One evening, after another discussion about bills, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. I looked older than I felt, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the constant low-grade anxiety I carried. That was the first time I asked myself quietly what exactly I was paying for, not in money but in peace, in autonomy, in the version of myself I was slowly trading away. I didn't bring it up right then, I waited. I told myself I needed the right moment, the right words, the right tone. Waiting became my default response. The longer I waited, the more complicated it felt to speak up because by then I had set a precedent. I had become reliable in a way that left little room for refusal. Reliability is praised until it becomes a case. Sophia sensed the shift before I voiced it. She grew more attentive, more affectionate, as if reinforcing the bond would smooth over whatever doubts I hadn't yet expressed. I wanted to believe that love and dependency were separate things, but they had begun to blur in ways that made me uneasy. I asked myself if I was loved for who I was or for what I provided. I hated that I couldn't answer that question with certainty. I thought about leaving then, about finding another place, about reclaiming a version of my retirement that felt lighter. But the idea of leaving felt like failure, and failure at this stage of life feels heavier than it did when I was younger. There's less room to start over, or at least that's what it feels like when you're standing at the edge of a choice you've delayed too long. So I stayed. I stayed because staying was easier than explaining. I stayed because I was afraid of what silence would feel like again. I stayed because I told myself this was the price of connection and that every meaningful relationship demands sacrifice. What I didn't admit to myself was that sacrifice without consent is just loss by another name. If you're listening to this and thinking I should have known better, you're probably right. I tell myself that now too. But knowing better and doing better are separated by fear, and fear has a way of sounding reasonable when it's dressed up as patience, understanding, or love. By the time I understood that the cost was no longer theoretical, it was real and it was already being collected. The moment I finally said something out loud, it surprised both of us. It wasn't planned and it wasn't delivered with the calm authority I imagined in my head. It slipped out one evening when I was more tired than careful, when the weight of the day had worn down the part of me that kept smoothing everything over. I said I needed space. Not angrily, not accusing anyone, just a simple statement that I thought might open a conversation. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting ever could. Sophia looked confused at first, then hurt, and then something else I hadn't prepared for, a kind of disbelief, as if the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted without warning. She asked what I meant, and I realized in that moment how unpracticed I was at explaining my own needs. I had spent so long accommodating everyone else that my words felt clumsy and incomplete. I tried to talk about feeling crowded, about needing time alone, about wanting to understand what our future actually looked like. As I spoke, I could hear how unfamiliar the language sounded, even to me. These were thoughts I had kept tucked away, examined only in silence, never tested in daylight. Saying them out loud made them feel both fragile and overdue. Sophia listened, but the conversation didn't unfold the way I hoped. She reminded me of everything we had built together, of the ways I had already shown my commitment, of how much her family depended on the stability I provided. None of it was said with malice. It was factual, grounded in a reality we had slowly constructed together. That was the problem. I had helped build something I no longer knew how to step back from without knocking it down. I remember feeling a strange mix of guilt and resentment as she spoke. Guilt because I had allowed expectations to form without challenging them earlier. Resentment because I felt trapped by my own generosity. Both emotions pointed back at me, not at her. I had taught everyone around me who I was willing to be, and now I was trying to rewrite that definition halfway through the story. After that conversation, nothing exploded, but nothing returned to how it was either. There was a subtle tension that lingered, a sense that we were both aware of a fault line beneath the surface. I became more conscious of every expense, every request, every assumption that passed unspoken. Awareness didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and clarity is uncomfortable when it confirms what you've been avoiding. I started keeping track, not obsessively, but enough to notice patterns. How often I paid versus how often anyone asked what I needed. How easily my discomfort was met with reassurance instead of change. I realized that love, at least in the way I was experiencing it, had become conditional on my silence. As long as I didn't disturb the arrangement, things stayed warm. The moment I hinted at limits, the warmth cooled. That realization sat with me longer than I expected. It made me question not just this relationship, but the habits I had carried my whole life. I had always been the one who smoothed things over, who stepped in to solve problems, who believed that being useful made me valuable. Aging hadn't erased that instinct. If anything, it had intensified it because usefulness felt like proof I still mattered. I thought about my earlier years, about how often I had avoided conflict at work, in marriage, in friendships, choosing stability over honesty. Those choices had seemed small at the time, reasonable compromises in the name of peace. Now, standing in a different country at a different stage of life, I could see the pattern clearly. Peace that depends on self-erasure doesn't last, it just postpones the reckoning. Financially, the strain was becoming impossible to ignore. What I had once justified as temporary help had turned into a monthly baseline I hadn't planned for. My savings were still there, but the margin felt thinner, the future less secure. Retirement is supposed to be a time when the numbers finally stop keeping you up at night. Instead, I found myself doing calculations in my head again, wondering how long I could maintain a life that no longer felt like my own. I considered leaving more seriously then. Not dramatically, not in anger, just the practical idea of finding another place, reclaiming some distance. But every time I imagined it, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Leaving meant admitting I had made a mistake, not just to others, but to myself. It meant facing the quiet again, the very thing I had run from when I came to Mexico in the first place. So I delayed. I told myself I needed more time, that things might adjust naturally, that conversations take time to sink in. Delay is a comforting strategy because it feels like patience, but it's often just fear in disguise. Each week that passed without change made the eventual decision harder, not easier. The hardest part was recognizing that no one here saw me as trapped. From the outside, I looked generous, settled, even lucky. I was living in a warm country with a younger partner and a full household. The story looked good, it just didn't feel good from the inside. That disconnect between appearance and reality is a lonely place to sit, especially when you're old enough to know better but still unsure how to fix it. I started to wonder what I was really afraid of. It wasn't confrontation, not exactly. It was the idea that if I stopped providing, I might stop being wanted altogether. That fear doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers, especially to men who have tied their worth to what they can offer rather than who they are. At 59, I was confronting that truth in a way I never had before, and it shook me more than I like to admit. I wish I could say I found clarity quickly after that. I did. Understanding a problem doesn't automatically give you the courage to solve it. Sometimes it just makes the weight feel heavier because now you can name it. I was standing in the middle of a life I had helped create, unsure whether staying would cost me more than leaving, and realizing that either choice would require me to finally stop avoiding discomfort. That was the moment I understood something that would have sounded obvious years earlier. Love doesn't save you from loneliness if you lose yourself inside it. And when you realize that too late, the question is whether there's a cost. The question is how much of yourself you're willing to lose before you finally decide it's too much. The decision didn't arrive in a rush, and it didn't come with relief the way people imagine these moments do. It arrived quietly one ordinary morning when I was sitting at the small table in the kitchen, drinking coffee and listening to the apartment wake up around me. Voices, footsteps, the clatter of dishes. Life moving on without asking me how I felt about it. That was when it became clear that if I didn't choose something soon, the choice would be made for me by default. I realized I had stopped imagining my future altogether. Not big plans, not even small ones. My days were about maintaining balance, keeping things from tipping too far in any direction. That's not living, that's managing decline. And for someone who came to Mexico believing he was starting over, that truth landed harder than I expected. I thought about the version of myself that had boarded the plane months earlier, hopeful, nervous, but open. That man believed he was brave for leaving his old life behind. What he didn't understand was that courage doesn't end when you arrive somewhere new. Sometimes it's required even more after you've settled in, when walking away costs more than staying ever did. I began preparing quietly, not in secret but without announcements. I looked at other apartments, smaller ones, simpler ones, places that felt like they belonged to one person. Each visit stirred a mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because I knew what the change would imply, relief because for the first time in a while I could imagine space again, space to think, to breathe, to be alone without feeling like I was abandoning anyone. When I finally told Sophia I was moving out, the conversation was calm on the surface and heavy underneath. She asked why we couldn't adjust things where we were, why distance was necessary. I told her the truth as clearly as I could manage, that I needed to feel like myself again, that I was losing something I didn't know how to replace. She listened, but I could see the disappointment settling in, the reshaping of expectations I had helped build. Her family reacted with confusion more than anger. They had come to see my presence as stable, dependable. Removing myself from that equation disrupted more than just a relationship. That realization brought another wave of guilt, but this time it was different. It was the guilt of choosing myself after too long choosing everyone else. That kind of guilt doesn't mean you're wrong, it means you're changing. Moving my things into a new place felt strangely anticlimactic. No dramatic goodbye, no confrontation, just boxes and bags and the quiet acknowledgement that a chapter was closing. The first night alone, I sat on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet, listening to the unfamiliar silence. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was honest. There was no one to perform for, no role to play. In the weeks that followed, the emotional cost became clearer than the financial one. I felt ashamed not because I had left, but because I had stayed as long as I did. I replayed moments in my head, early opportunities to speak up, to set limits, to ask harder questions. Regret has a way of sharpening hindsight into something that feels cruel, but I tried not to let it turn into self-punishment. Understanding is only useful if it leads to compassion, even toward yourself. Sophia and I spoke less often. When we did, the conversations were polite, careful. Whatever bond we had shared was now framed by what had changed. I could feel the absence of the ease we once had, and that absence confirmed what I already knew. What held us together had been as much about circumstance as affection. When the circumstances shifted, so did everything else. Financially, I was still standing. I hadn't lost everything, despite what people like to assume when they hear stories like mine. But I had lost more than money. I had lost time, peace of mind, and a piece of confidence I didn't realize was so fragile. At 59, you don't take those losses lightly. You measure them against the years you have left and wonder how many more lessons you can afford to learn the hard way. There were moments when loneliness returned, sharp and familiar. The quiet I had feared was back, but it felt different now. It wasn't empty in the same way, it was reflective, sometimes uncomfortable, but also honest. I began to see that loneliness isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's the space where you hear yourself clearly again. I thought often about the idea that love would save me. That belief had guided so many of my choices, not just here but throughout my life. The truth I was finally facing was simpler and harder to accept. Love doesn't save you from yourself. It doesn't erase the need for boundaries or the responsibility to protect your own well-being. If anything, it demands more honesty, not less. What this experience cost me can't be summed up in a number. It cost me the illusion that starting over means starting fresh without baggage. We bring ourselves with us wherever we go, habits included. Geography doesn't cure patterns, it just gives them a new backdrop. Mexico wasn't the mistake. The mistake was believing a change of place could compensate for a lack of clarity about what I needed and what I was willing to give. As I settled into my new routine, smaller and quieter than the one I had imagined, I began to rebuild a sense of independence that felt earned, not forced. Simple things mattered again, choosing how to spend my day, sitting in silence without explaining it, feeling responsible for myself before anyone else. These weren't dramatic victories, but they were real, and they reminded me that it's never too late to reclaim agency, even if you wish you'd done it sooner. I knew there was still one thing left to confront, though, not the relationship, not the move, but the meaning I would take from it all. Because stories like this can harden you if you let them, or they can teach you something quieter and more lasting. And as I approached the end of this chapter, I understood that the final cost wouldn't be measured by what I lost, but by whether I allowed myself to learn what the experience was trying to show me. I'm telling you this now from a place that's calmer than where I was when it happened, but I won't pretend it's completely settled. Some lessons don't land cleanly. They sit with you, they age with you, and they change shape as you do. I'm 59, and I understand now that wisdom doesn't arrive as a reward for surviving something. It arrives when you finally stop lying to yourself about why you made the choices you did. For a long time, I framed my story as one about love gone wrong, or about cultural differences I didn't fully grasp. Those explanations were comforting because they placed the weight somewhere outside of me, but the truth is quieter and harder to hold. I didn't come to Mexico just for love. I came because I was afraid of being alone with myself, and I mistook being needed for being valued. That confusion cost me more than money ever could. I see now how carefully I avoided asking the questions that might have disrupted the peace I thought I had found. I avoided them because I was tired of starting over, tired of disappointment, tired of feeling like time was no longer on my side. I told myself that compromise was maturity, that silence was patience, that generosity would eventually be returned in understanding. What I didn't see was how those beliefs allowed me to slowly disappear from my own life. There's a particular kind of regret that comes with realizing you gave away parts of yourself willingly, even lovingly, without being asked. It's not anger, it's not bitterness. It's a sadness that feels older than you are because it's rooted in knowing you knew better at some level and chose comfort over honesty anyway. That's the part I sit with now, not to punish myself, but to understand myself more clearly than I ever have. If you're listening to this and you're older, maybe recently retired, maybe standing at the edge of a big change, I want you to hear this without defensiveness. Wanting connection doesn't make you weak. Wanting love doesn't make you foolish. But postponing your own needs until they vanish isn't kindness, and it isn't. It's abandonment, even if you're the one doing the abandoning. Mexico didn't take anything from me. No one tricked me into losing myself. I participated in every step because it felt easier than facing the quiet truths I'd been avoiding for years. That realization doesn't shame me anymore. It grounds me. It reminds me that responsibility isn't about blame, it's about clarity, and clarity is something you can still choose, no matter how late it feels. These days, my life is smaller than the one I imagined when I first arrived, but it's more honest. I wake up knowing the shape of my day belongs to me. I still feel lonely sometimes, but I don't confuse that feeling with failure anymore. Loneliness passes. Losing yourself doesn't, unless you decide to go looking for yourself again. What love actually cost me wasn't my savings or my pride. It cost me time spent ignoring my own voice. And what it gave me in the end was the understanding that love isn't meant to save you. It's meant to meet you where you already stand, intact and present, not emptied out and hoping someone else will fill the space. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after this, it's this. Starting over isn't about where you go or who you meet. It's about whether you're finally willing to stay honest with yourself when it would be easier not to be. I learned that late, but not too late. And if you're listening to this, neither have you.